I hadn't been back to Cedar Hollow in over a decade, but there was something about this fall, the cold snap in the October air, that called me back. The leaves were the same, blazing red and gold as they crunched beneath my feet. Yet, it all seemed terribly still. The last time I'd stood upon this street, there had been laughter, the rushing excitement of fall festival preparations. Now, it was silent. Almost too silent. This had been the festival that made this little town the envy of many. It hadn't been held in years. I could still remember it so well from my childhood, the hayrides, pumpkin contests, and the parade of costumes through the square. But then, after that year, it all stopped. I never knew why. I stepped out of the car and stared up at my grandmother's old house. The shutters were still slightly askew, just like I remembered, and the ivy had taken over most of the stone walls. It looked almost like time had stopped here, much as it had in the rest of Cedar Hollow. "Feels like a ghost town," I muttered, huddling in my coat as the sudden cut of a wind blew through the trees. I walked up the creaky porch steps, noticing something off. Across the street, a few houses had pumpkins on their doorsteps. But they weren't carved into jack-o'-lanterns. They were left whole, untouched, as if no one had even celebrated Halloween this year. Odd, considering it was only a few days away. Why did they cancel it? I whispered, feeling that all too familiar sense of unease creep in. Of course, there were whispers. The townsfolk said it was because of what happened all those years ago. This bunch of kids just vanished during the festival. Again, half the story, nobody talked about what had really occurred. Not even my grandmother, who had lived here all her life. The creak of the door as I unlocked and stepped inside the house was familiar. Dust and old books thickened the air with their smell. Everything was as I had left it, the old furniture, photographs on the mantel, boxes of forgotten memories in the corner of the living room. There was something else, too. A feeling that wouldn't go away. Dropping the bags, I headed for the kitchen. And that was when I saw it, an envelope lying on the table, with my name scribbled on it in jumpy handwriting. My grandmother's handwriting. My hands were shaking as I reached for the envelope. The paper was faded and fragile to the touch of my fingers, as if it had sat there for years waiting for me to return. My name was scrawled across the front in my grandmother's shaky handwriting, a reminder of how frail she had been in the final years. I hesitated, looking at the envelope in my hand, feeling the quiet house close in around me. There had always been something mysterious about Cedar Hollow, especially after the town had called off the festival. It wasn't only because of the tragedy, that was an excuse taken up by all. Still, something deeper was beneath the surface, something nobody wanted to talk about. Not even Gran. With a deep breath, I tore open the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of yellowed paper, folded neatly. I unfolded it, my eyes running down the short, cryptic message. "Don't ask them about it. Don't talk about it. You won't like what you find." That was all. No explanation, no signature, just that chilling warning. My heart thundered in my chest, and a wave of unease washed over me. What had my grandmother been so afraid of? I glanced around the room, suddenly hyper-aware of the silence. Outside, the wind had picked up, whistling through the old window panes in a mournful melody, and the house creaked as it always had. But now it felt heavy, almost, like it was watching me. I jammed the letter back into the envelope and into my coat pocket. I didn't want to think anymore, but I knew I wouldn't forget. Not now. I'd come back to Cedar Hollow for answers, and all I'd gotten so far were more questions. I needed to get out, clear my head. I snatched up my keys and went out the door onto the chill of the evening air. The sun had already set below the horizon, leaving the street in a dim, orange haze. The leaves crinkled with the wind as I walked down the quiet street, my footsteps echoing through the silence. As I passed the old square, I couldn't but notice an empty place in which the festival had once been held. Memories rushed back in, the sound of laughter, play, sweet smell of cider. It was now nothing but an empty lot, overgrown with weeds, as if it had never existed, erased by the town. A shadow moved in the corner of my vision, and I turned quickly, my heart missing a beat. But there was nothing there. Just the wind, playing tricks on my mind. Or so I thought. On the edge of the square stood a person, almost imperceptible in the fast-fading light. I squinted to make out who it was, but before I could reach him, he had vanished in the shadows. I was frozen, my eyes locked exactly on the spot where the figure had been. My heart picked up its pace, and for a moment, I considered calling out, but something restrained me. That form, it hadn't moved like a normal person. There was something not quite right. I breathed in deeply to shake this uncomfortable sensation creeping up my spine. It was just a person crossing the square, some trick of the low light. But the quickness with which this person disappeared into the shadows did not feel right. I started to walk again, my pace quickening as I made my way toward the edge of town, where the woods began. I'd spent many autumns here as a child, exploring the quiet trails lined with golden leaves. But tonight, the woods seemed darker, more forbidding. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, watching, waiting. Something caught my eye as I approached the entrance to the trail, a faint glow emanating from further in the woods. At first, I thought it was the moonlight filtering through the branches, but the glow was too bright, too constant. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But something, maybe curiosity, maybe that damn letter, pushed me forward. I followed the light, my footsteps soft in the dirt path as the woods swallowed me whole. As I neared a small clearing, the glow grew brighter until, in the middle of that space, something stood waiting that stopped my heart. A small group of pumpkins, no different from the ones I'd seen gracing the porches of the homes I'd passed, sat in a perfect circle on the ground. Their faces were uncarved but glowing with an eerie unnatural light, as if they were waiting for something or someone. My breath caught in my throat, and I wanted to run to get out of those woods and never look back, but my feet seemed rooted to the spot. I was staring at the pumpkins as the air grew colder, more oppressive, around me. And then I heard it. A soft whisper, barely audible, carried on the wind. It was faint, but I could just make out the words. "It's coming back. You can't stop it." The whisper sent a shiver down my spine, and I whipped around, expecting to find someone or something standing behind me. But there was nobody. There were just the trees, quiet and motionless. My heart raced in my chest as I backed away from the clearing, the strange glow of the pumpkins growing remote. The whisper stayed with me, echoing over and over in my mind. What was coming back? What couldn't be stopped? I needed answers. And somehow, I had the sensation that the town my grandmother had been concealing them from me all this time. I stumbled out into the woods, my head reeling. The soft, ghostly whisper still echoed in my ears, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake it. Something was coming back, something the town had tried to bury, to forget. But now it seemed that dark secret was seeping to the surface, whether they wanted it to or not. The letter sat like an anvil in my pocket as I walked back to my grandmother's house. "Don't talk about it. You won't like what you find." Her words now sounded a great deal more ominous, as if she'd been trying to save me from something quite a bit worse than the truth. I knew I couldn't drop it. I have been lying here all night, my head filled with half-considered thoughts. Every time I shut my eyes, I see those pumpkins shining in the woods, their light flickering soft and alive. And every time, too, that whisper, always the same words, over and over again. By morning, I knew I needed to do something. I couldn't just let it be. My grandmother had kept this secret, but there had to be someone else in town who knew more, someone who remembered what really happened all those years ago. I walked into town in cool morning air that nipped at my skin. The square was quiet, almost abandoned, save for a few people moving about with their heads down, as if deliberately avoiding looking at anything or anyone. It was as if the whole town had been wrapped in a thick fog of silence and fear. There was only one person that I knew I could ask, and that was an old friend of my grandmother's, Mrs. Caldwell. She had lived in Cedar Hollow longer than anybody, and if there was anybody to tell what happened, it would be her. When I finally arrived at her house, the shutters were pulled, and the yard was grown over with weeds. I knocked on the door, feeling my heart racing in my chest, but there was no response. Centuries had passed, it seemed, and the door creaked open a crack, and Mrs. Caldwell stooped, milled face framed by gray hair peered out, eyes hard and suspicious. "You shouldn't have come back," she whispered, her voice barely intelligible. My breath stuck in my throat. "What do you mean? What's going on in this town? Why did they cancel the festival?" Mrs. Caldwell's eyes flickered with something, fear, maybe, or regret. "Some things are better left forgotten. But now that you're back, it's too late." "Too late for what?" I pressed, pulse growing faster. "What happened all those years ago?" She said nothing for a long moment, just stood there staring at me, it seemed weighing in her mind whether to tell me or not. She finally let out a sigh, and swung the door wider. "Come in," she said. "But you are not going to like what you hear." Mrs. Caldwell's house was no less creepy inside than it had been outside. The air was thick with dust and the smell of old wood, the shadows seemed to clench to the corners of the room, as if they were hiding something. She motioned for me to sit down at her worn kitchen table, but a feeling I wasn't ready to hear what she had to say wouldn't leave my head. She finally sat down opposite me, her bony hands still quivering a little as she folded them across her lap. Neither of us spoke for a moment. I was not quite certain whether to push her into talking or wait for her to collect her thoughts. Finally, she did break the silence. "You've heard the stories, haven't you?" Mrs. Caldwell said, her voice barely above a whisper. "About the children who disappeared during the festival all those years ago?" I nodded. "Yeah, but nobody ever speaks about it. They just canceled the festival, and that was it." No answers. Mrs. Caldwell's lips pursed into a thin line, and she looked sideways, out toward the window, as if expecting something else to peer back in. "They didn't call it off just because of the disappearances," she said, speaking with almost exaggerated slowness. "They called it off because the town wasn't ever supposed to have the festival to begin with." "What do you mean?" I asked, leaning forward. "The festival was a tradition, wasn't it?" She shook her head. "The town didn't come up with the idea of the festival. It was given to us. The people who settled Cedar Hollow found something in these woods, something they shouldn't have disturbed. They thought they could control it, keep it satisfied with celebrations and offerings. But they were wrong." A cold shiver ran down my spine. "What exactly did they find?" Mrs. Caldwell hesitated, her eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that sent my skin crawling. "Something old. Something hungry. The festival was meant to distract it, to keep it from taking what it wanted. But that year, the offerings weren't enough. The children, they were taken, and no one could stop it." My breath caught in my throat. "And now that the festival's been gone for so long, is it coming back?" She nodded grimly. "It never left. The pumpkins, the whispering, the shadows, it's all starting again because we failed to keep the balance. And now that you're back, I'm afraid it's only a matter of time before it takes what it wants." I leaned back, the weight of her words sinking in. The town hadn't just cancelled the festival to protect people, they did it to keep something far darker from reawaking. And now, after all these years, it seemed that darkness was returning. But why now? Why was I at the very center of this? I stumbled out of Mrs. Caldwell's house, her words churning in my head like fallen leaves on an autumn day whipped by the wind. To think that something evil had lain dormant here in Cedar Hollow, just waiting for an opportunity to strike again, sent ripples of horror down my spine. But what was truly terrifying, her final warning my arrival had triggered its rebirth. Why me? What connection did I have with the dark history of the town? Sky had turned into that dull gray from the sun, which had already begun to set, casting long shadows down the streets. I walked at a snail's pace, my mind filling with questions. Mrs. Caldwell had spoken of something very, very ancient, something that needed to be kept at bay. But if so, why was nobody ever telling me? Why did my own grandmother, who lived here all her life, not tell me? I approached her house, determined to find answers. There must be something in an old journal or just a letter that might explain what was going on. I searched through her stuff, feeling like time was ticking away for me. The whole town was draped in silence, and somehow, I couldn't get rid of this feeling that something was always watching and only waiting for the perfect moment to strike. It had been in the attic, buried beneath boxes that had gathered dust and items nobody remembered heeding. A little leather-bound journal stared at me, my grandmother's name inscribed on the cover. I opened it, my hands shaking, yellowing pages met my eyes. The first several entries were banal, grocery lists, musings of the day. But flipping through the pages, my eye landed on something. A very frantic, hasty handwriting ranted in an entry dated the day after the children had vanished. I told them we should have left it alone. We had no right to touch. Now it's angry, and the kids. They're just gone. Taken. We can't fix this, but we can cover it up. We must make sure no one ever comes looking. But someday, it's going to come back. I only hope I'm not here to see that. A chill ran down my spine. My grandmother had known. She had been a part of whatever had happened that night. And now, all these years later, I was the one left to deal with the consequences. But there was more. The last entry in the journal was from the day she had written the letter I found in the kitchen. It's happening again, I can feel it. The air is too still, the shadows are shifting where they shouldn't. I tried to warn her, but I know she won't listen. She's just like I was, curiosity and stubbornness. But this isn't something you can fight, this is something you must survive. I slammed the journal shut, my heart racing. It was the reason Grandma Edith had been trying to warn me all along. She knew this darkness wasn't something I could stop. But what was I supposed to do, just sit here and wait for it to take me, too? I needed to find a way to break the cycle. I sat in the dim attic, my hands still clutched around the journal, the weight of my grandmother's words heavy upon me. She had known this day would arise, and now it was time for me to figure out what to do. The more and more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't rely on anyone in this town. They had been complacent in the silence, hiding the truth for years. Whatever had taken the children, whatever ancient force haunted Cedar Hollow, had gone unchecked for far too long. But there must be some way of stopping it. I couldn't allow myself to believe it was one of those inevitable things. My grandmother had hinted at survival, not at defeat. She had left behind breadcrumbs, clues. I just had to figure out how to put the pieces together before it was too late. I spent the rest of the afternoon poring over that journal, trying to make sense of the entries in it. Full of mentions of the woods, of the strange pumpkins that had begun appearing before the children vanished, and of the festival itself, it became pretty clear that this festival wasn't some harmless celebration. It was a sort of offering, one meant to keep the darkness at bay. But now the festival was over, and the darkness would slowly cover everything once more. I threw the journal and flashlight into my pack, setting off determined to find whatever that connection in the woods that my grandmother had hinted at. It was the only place that seemed to hold any answers, the place the pumpkins shone, where the shadows whispered. When night fell, I moved through to the same path that I had strayed off into the evening before. It was colder, heavier, it felt as if the trees themselves were watching. Leaves crisped in the wind, but under that another sound, softer. A whisper. Just like before. It's coming back. My spine tingled at the voice, but I continued on. The beam of my flashlight cut through the thickening fog. The deeper into the woods I walked, the more familiar the path became, even though I'd only walked the thing once before. It was as if the woods were pulling me in, guiding me toward the truth. Finally, I burst into the clearing. The pumpkins were still there, laid out in a perfect circle, their faces still uncarved but shining with that strange unnatural light. A wave of fear ran through me at the sight of them, but I couldn't turn back now. I took another step closer, the light of my flashlight flickering as I approached. Something shifted in the air. The whispering grew louder, no longer the faint voice on the wind, but a chorus of jumbled murmurs. I could feel their presence now, not just in the air but in the earth beneath my feet and in the trees surrounding me. The very earth seemed to thrum with energy and the pumpkin's glow brightened, pulsing in time with my racing heartbeat. Then, without warning, the earth trembled. I tumbled back, the flashlight in my fist flickering out completely as the ground beneath the pumpkin started to crack. A low rumble echoed through the clearing, and I watched in horror as the dirt shifted and parted to reveal something buried deep below. A door. That door, which had lay hidden beneath the pile of pumpkins, scared me silly. It was ancient, of dark, weathered wood, half buried in the earth. Those writhing pumpkins pulsed as if full of life, glowing with an otherworldly light, as if release emanated from this now-revealed door. The atmosphere was heavy, almost to the point of being choking, as if the very forest was holding its breath while it waited for my next move. I took a cautious step forward, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers that had haunted me all this time grew louder, more insistent, as if calling me toward the door. The moment of hesitation seized me. Every single instinct was screaming for me to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But I knew unless I opened that door, I would never know what haunted Cedar Hollow, and what had been haunting me. I knelt down and, with shaking hands, dusted off the dirt from the door's surface that remained. The wood felt cold to the touch, while my fingers traced the edge around the handle. I felt this strange pull, as if the door was willing me to open it. One more time, I looked around the clearing. Nobody was there. The woods were quiet but for that soft whispering that seemed to be issuing from beneath. I swallowed hard, took a deep breath, and pulled the door open. A cool breath of air wafted up from the dark space below, carrying on its breath the faint scent of damp earth and something else, something old, and rotting. My flashlight sputtered back to life just as I played the beam down into the hole, illuminating a set of narrow stone steps leading down into the darkness. For a moment, I was there, my head reeling with all the thoughts. This was it. Whatever had been hiding beneath Cedar Hollow, whatever had taken the children, was down there. Now I was about to face it. Slowly I made my way down the stairs. The air grew colder at every step I descended, while the walls surrounding me were damp and slick with moss. My flashlight's beam could cut through the thick darkness barely, and I could make out carvings, faint, on the stone walls, symbols and markings disturbingly familiar. Louder now, the whispers echoed off of stone walls, and with a growing sense of trepidation I realized they weren't whispers any longer. They were voices, faint, distant, but undeniably human. I came to the last stair and entered what could be described as some small underground chamber. The same symbols I had seen on the pumpkins faced me from all the walls, and the stone altar stood right in the center of the room, also full of dust and cobwebs. And then I saw them, faint outlines in the shadows. Small figures, no taller than children, standing at the edges of the room. None of them moved, none of them spoke, but their presence watched me from the darkness. My heart danced up into my throat as I edged closer to the altar. There, carved into the stone, was a single word. A name. Mine. My name, carved in crude letters in the altar, sent a shiver down my entire body. Long, eerie shadows danced across the chamber as my flashlight flickered once more. Part of me wanted to will it to be some wild coincidence, that this could be someone else with the same name, but I knew better. The connection I felt to this place, to the voices and the shadows lurking in the darkness, was undeniable. The figures standing in the corners of the room, small childlike forms, did not move one iota, barely even outlined in the very faint light. I knew their eyes were on me, an oppressive weight upon my chest that I couldn't push away. The air grew heavier and heavier by the second, the faint whispers coalescing into some sort of low humming drone. I stepped back from the altar as my mind was racing. How could my name have been here, buried beneath the town for such a time? What had my family kept from me? The answer came almost right then and there. In the journal, my grandmother had written that the festival of the town was more than a celebration, it was a means of protecting the town from something dark and something ancient. And now, I realized, it wasn't just the town that had been bound by that darkness. It was my own family. I turned and scanned the room, my eyes searching for some kind of answer, some kind of explanation. My flashlight flickered over more symbols etched into the wall, strange, twisting shapes that seemed to pulse with energy. And then I saw it, a series of drawings, crudely carved into the stone. They told a story. At the very top was a figure, standing in front of a crowd, a lantern held high up in the air. Behind that was a giant shadow looming behind the figure, its shape twisting and shifting, almost human but not quite. Below that were more figures, smaller ones being offered up to the shadow. And at the very bottom was a final image, a single figure, bound in chains, standing in the center of the circle of pumpkins. The pumpkins had always been a warning, a sign that the darkness was returning. And the figure in the drawing, it was me. The earth shook again, the chill in the air began to bite deeper, and the voices rose higher, urging. With a growing sense of terror, I realized I wasn't alone. The figures in the corners of the room lurched forward, moving, shifting in the dark. They stepped closer, though their feet made no sound, just their heaviness, and as they came nearer, I saw their faces, or what was left of them. They were the children, the ones who had disappeared all those years ago. Now, they were coming after me. Before me stood the children, those who had vanished all those years ago, pale and gaunt of face, their eyes black voids that reflected nothing but the chill darkness of the chamber. The whispering that had plagued me for days was gone, replaced by an oppressive silence that leaned in against me from all sides. My heart was pounding, every instinct shrieking at me to flee, yet I was unable to move. I wasn't a visitor in this place, I was a part of it, just as they were. The children drew closer, their footsteps noiseless on the damp stone floor, and I could see etched into their faces, into the lines and folds of skin, into every particular, the dirt and decay, the weight of the years they'd spent down beneath Cedar Hollow. They didn't say it, but it was enough. The victims of an awful bargain, taken in place of the offerings this town used to make. Now they wanted me to take their place. I stumbled backward, my breathing in short, panicked bursts. My hand clung to my grandmother's journal, as if it somehow could shield me. The drawings on the wall, the symbols, it all made sense now. My family had been guarding the secret of this town, and I had come here to continue that duty. But I was not ready. I was not willing. It shook harder this time, and those pumpkins in the clearing above seemed even brighter, casting a long shadow which danced along the walls of the chamber. The air was full of earth and rot, and I knew something far older, far darker, than anything I could ever have imagined stirred. The darkness itself had awoken. The children were just the start. They were messengers, really, dispatched to remind me of the town's outstanding karmic debt. The real evil still lay in wait, just beneath the surface. The entity my grandmother had written about, the thing that had been disturbed all those years ago, was coming for me. I stumbled back toward the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the low guttural growl of something stirring deep below and knew I only had moments to escape. But as I turned to run, the children blocked my path, their hollow eyes fixed on me, their arms outstretched. "You can't leave," one of them whispered, the voice barely a mortal echo of times long past. "You're part of it now." Their words fell like a blow, and with a weight of growing dread, I knew they were right. There was no way out. The town had brought me back for some reason. The pact had to be upheld, and I was now bound to uphold it. But I wasn't about to give in. With an adrenaline-sparked rush, I pushed the children aside and didn't take into account that their freezing hands reached for me as I went. I ran up the stairs, flashing my light upward into the blackness, and flung myself out the door into the clearing. Now the pumpkins were almost blinding, and the very air snapped with power as the ground kept shuddering. I knew what needed to be done. Shaking, I reached for one of the pumpkins and flung it to the ground, where it broke into 100 pieces. The light within flickered out, and in that moment the whispering had stopped. I smashed another, and with each pumpkin I demolished the energy built up around me like an electric storm. But darkness doesn't go away that easily. The moment I went to crush the last pumpkin, the earth beneath me split apart with a deafening crack, and a column of black, boiling noxiousness burst forth from the chasm. It writhed and twisted, taking shape before my eyes, a gigantic form of darkness and malevolence. This was it, the thing that had haunted Cedar Hollow for generations, took the children, demanded such offerings from the festival. And now, it had come for me. But I wasn't going to let it win. I pulled her journal out of my backpack and held it up like a shield. It recoiled slightly, its shadowy form wavered in the glow of the broken pumpkins. "You don't run this town anymore," I yelled, my voice shaking but full of defiance. "We're done with you." A low, rumbling growl emanated from the entity, yet it did not stir. The air around me was electric from the tension, and for a moment, I really thought it might attack. But then it began to back away, sinking into the ground again, the darkness dissipating as the fissure in the ground sealed itself. The whispering stopped. The glowing of the pumpkins ebbed, and once more there was stillness in the air. I stood there breathless, my heart pounding in my chest, as the last remnants of the entity disappeared into the ground. The children were gone, their presence lifted, and the oppressive weight which had hung over Cedar Hollow for so long seemed to vanish along with them. I had broken the cycle. But I knew, deep down, that Cedar Hollow would never be the same. The town had kept secrets for too long, and now that the truth came into the light, there was no going back. The festival was gone, the dark history of this town laid bare. And I wasn't a visitor anymore. I was part of it now.